Good morning. I'm Stu Eisenstadt. I am the co-chair of the Euro Growth Initiative of the Atlantic Council with Jose Manuel Barroso. I want to welcome all of you here. We're very honored to have European Commissioner Pierre Moscovici, and he and I interacted very favorably during the 1990s when I was ambassador to the EU and he was a commissioner, and also finance minister, economic minister in France. The purpose of the Euro Growth Initiative is to look at how we can foster greater growth and prosperity in Europe, both now and after the Brexit referendum. Over the last 25 years, Europe has grown at roughly 1% lower GDP growth than the US, and it's had a more sluggish recovery from the fiscal crisis. Please use your hashtag, and that is with the EU growth. If you tweet this morning, Europe is facing some very fundamental challenges, and we're trying to provide through our task force and the Euro Growth Initiative with Andrea is leading, and you'll hear more from him shortly, how to stimulate thinking on restoring sustainable economic growth across Europe and confidence in the European system. The initiative aims to energize key stakeholders on both sides of the Atlantic to promote a deeper transatlantic partnership as we build a path for longer-term growth together. The U.S. has a very deep interest in stronger growth in Europe, and we also, by the way, have much to learn from you. This is not a finger-pointing exercise because you do many things much better than we do, including having less income inequality. I think we've made some important progress toward launching this initiative since we began in March of this year. We've addressed some of Europe's most pressing challenges. We've hosted 7 European commissioners, several ministers, central bank governors, and with the events and publications that we've already put forward, we look at how Europe can transform the challenges presented by the surge of refugees into opportunities, to make a case for TTIP, which is hanging by its fingernails, to explain the benefits of a positive future relationship between the EU and the UK, to assess the health of the European banking sector, and to analyze how Europe can attract more investment to foster growth. Just yesterday, Anders Asselin, a member of our Euro Growth Task Force, published a timely brief on Europe's excessive fiscal burden, and you can find a copy of this outside the room, or you can go on our website to read it. Let me now briefly introduce today's keynote speaker. Mr. Moscovici is the EU Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs, Taxation, and Customs. As Commissioner, he has the important and difficult task to create the conditions for a sound macroeconomic environment which is conducive to jobs, to growth, and to investment across the EU, based on sound public finances and a stable single currency. He comes with outstanding credentials. Before joining the Commission in 2014, he was a member of the French National Assembly, and he has served as Minister for Economy and Finance in the French government, which is when we first interacted. From 2004 to 2007, he was the Vice President and member of the European Parliament, so he's really done it all. He's been in his own National Assembly, he's been in the European Parliament, he's been a senior minister in the French government, and now has one of the single most important positions for the European Commission. So we're absolutely delighted, Mr. Commissioner, to have you here. And without further ado, please welcome the Commissioner to the stage, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Dear Ambassador Eisenstadt, dear Andrea, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to this event and for giving me the opportunity to explain where Europe is considering taking its fiscal policy. In the past, Europe's partners have aired concerns over the impact of our fiscal rules on growth, and that's one of the points you raised, Ambassador, 1 minute ago. I'm in Washington, D.C. for the annual meeting of the IMF, as well as meetings of the G7, G20, and also a lot of bilateral meetings. These are forums where such views have been expressed repeatedly. And these concerns are, of course, very legitimate. They are also mirrored in Europe. There is a fierce debate between those who support the continuation of fiscal consolidation and those who consider that boosting growth by damaging the rules should be a top priority. And this is a major political debate in Europe. This is even more true in my home country, France, which is facing elections. You've got elections here in a few months to come, and we are all looking at that all over the world. You may know that France will hold those elections. A significant number of candidates for presidential primaries across the political spectrum, or on the extreme right also, are questioning Europe's debt and deficit rules. Violating these rules is even an explicit and prominent platform plank for many of them. This is not my feeling. What I would like to explain today is how Europe will continue abiding by these rules without self-sabotaging and with a good deal of flexibility and intelligence. Let me first go back in time and remind you why the euro area members agreed to cap their debt and deficit levels, and I would recall the rules that are 60% of GDP for debt, which is not respected by anybody now in the Eurozone, and 3% of GDP for deficit, which is respected by almost everybody except one or two countries, including one I know best. To put it simply, these rules were the result of a political compromise. The euro currency is a shield. Joining the euro area means that you will benefit from conditions that were previously available only to Europe's strongest economy, meaning mostly Germany. In exchange, rules were needed to make sure that no member would abuse the system and act as a free rider. So it was, and it still is in a way, a trade-off, solidarity in exchange for fiscal discipline, i.e. common rules to keep our house in order. And European leaders cared enough about this trade-off to enshrine it in the Treaty of Maastricht, and then the treaties who followed. To put it a little bit more dramatically, these rules are the political conditions for the very existence of the euro. And for those who want to damage the rules, it's useful to recall that. This trade-off is still valid today, even if conditions have changed, of course, since the 90s, growth, inflation, interest rates, resilience of the financial sector. And my job as the EU Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs today is precisely to address current challenges while working with this balance, which should be unchanged. Over the years, Europe has applied itself to design smart public policies, i.e. policies that comply with the rules without crippling growth, both on paper but also in practice. First, I won't be too long on that. The rules have been gradually refined. They used to be a rather blunt instrument, catering poorly to particular national situations. Over the years, they have become smarter. The position of a country in the economic cycle, its efforts to implement major reforms, for instance, are now better taken into account. Smarter rules came with a price tag, which is complexity, and I will address this issue later. Over the past 2 years, we have also implemented these rules as soundly as possible, and this is also one of my best efforts. There is room for another word, which is flexibility. Flexibility in the framework of the rules, not against the rules or outside the rules. For instance, in January last year, we issued detailed new guidance on how investment efforts should be better taken into consideration within existing rules in support of jobs and growth, and that is, of course, necessary. We need to encourage those countries which invest or lead structural reforms. Another example, in July this year, 2016, the Commission proposed not to fine Spain and Portugal. Both countries failed to correct their deficits up to legal requirements, although they rolled out rigorous consolidation measures. And we had to decide on that. We decided not to fine. I was criticized for that. We were criticized for that. I'm proud that we did it. I think it was the right decision. Some may actually feel that we have become too lenient. Let me put it this way. Yes, political considerations came into play when we decided not to sanction Spain and Portugal. One, for example, is that Spain has not a definite government for a year, but only acting government. One such political consideration is how low the approval rate of the EU is today. I think if we would have sanctions, we would have been blamed for that. And the rules would have been criticized more if they were applied in a too blunt way. But we did not engage, I insist that, in politicizing. No rule was ever broken, and no rule will ever be broken as long as this Commission is in place. Smart rules and implementation practices are crucial at the current economic juncture and political juncture in Europe. We must all recall that we face a populist threat that is all over our countries. Economic recovery is ongoing, but it is still modest, it is uneven. Disparities across euro area member states persist. Unemployment is subsiding, but is still at unacceptably high levels. And you rightly mentioned the problems we face as to Eisenstadt. We have turned to a corner, but there is no time for complacency. We should not turn exclusively to monetary policy to address Europe's lingering weaknesses. This is a debate we always have here in those meetings in Washington. I fully support Mario Draghi. I think he's doing really the things the right way. But I also fully share his view that monetary policy cannot be the only game in town. So what's left for Europe? Basically a combination of structural reforms, determined support to investment, and of course, responsible fiscal policy. Looking forward, I see three possible avenues for progress on the fiscal front in Europe. The first one is simplification. Complexity is always a political problem. It fuels the suspicion that the rules are not applied or not uniformly applied. And this, in return, undermines the credibility of the European Commission, but also of the rules themselves. Simpler rules would enhance transparency and democratic oversight. But the counterpart is that they would also be blunter, striking the right balance between simplicity and intelligence will not be so easy. We refer to this as Europe's impossible trinity. We cannot have it all. We cannot have at the same time automatic, simple and intelligent rules. Simple yet intelligent rules call for more discretionary power. In other words, decisions would need to be less rule-based and more institutions-based. The ECB offers a compelling example of this model, but it does not have to bother as much with this modern-day nuisance that is called democracy. So unless we decide to seek inspiration from the taxation without representation car plates I have seen around DC, a fully institutions-based model for fiscal policy is not around the corner for Europe. So we still have to reflect on that. The second avenue is flexibility. Investments and far-reaching structural reforms feature more prominently in our implementation doctrine. But new developments bring new questions. What about expenses occurred due to the refugee crisis? They are massive, and they will be massive for years. And so we need to address that issue, especially the issue of the integration of refugees in the countries they are installed in. What about rising, and I know this in Washington and for you in the Atlantic Council is a major source of reflection. What about rising security costs in countries hit recently by terrorist attack? Our American friends ask us to spend more on defense, and there is a global reflection in Europe on how to do that. For example, I see that in France. But how is it compatible with the rules? So is there here a need to reflect on more flexibility? But they are not sacred or forever set in stones, those rules. This is a lively debate in European political circles today, and I expect that it will remain so for the near future. There are different ways to inject more flexibility in the system. One I would call the 6 feet underway. We could neutralize certain categories of expenditures under the rules. For instance, some in my country asked for defense-related expenditure. This would typically lead to very creative accounting at national level. So I believe there is I will disappoint some of my friends in France. I would say a cleaner avenue, shared resources pooled from national budgets. National contribution to the pool could be then neutralized under the pact. If we Europeanize defense, it's simpler to have an intelligent flexibility. And a clean option would have the additional benefit of prefiguring a fully fledged fiscal capacity for the euro area. We'll discuss that. I'm in favor of such a fiscal capacity. Third and last avenue, the overall euro area fiscal stance. I have pushed for this notion to feature more prominently in our thinking, even though in some European capitals it is an anathema. The US as a fiscal stance, as a country, as a federal state. The euro area does not have one such. What the euro area has is the ex post combination of 17 largely uncoordinated national fiscal stances. I'm taking the program countries outside, so it's 18 now because Cyprus is out of the program. In other words, you have a fiscal stance by design. We in Europe have a fiscal stance by chance. You have it ex ante, we have it ex post. In spite of this flow, a pattern has emerged over the past 2 years. In my first year of office, the overall fiscal stance was broadly neutral. Today, thanks to the refugee expenditures, it is slightly positive. And in his annual speech on the State of the European Union in September, President Juncker indicated that the European Commission will promote a positive fiscal stance for the euro area, and I fully support that. We will have to take into account significant heterogeneities across the euro area to implement this. Some member states will not be able to contribute to the positive fiscal stance due to their elevated debt levels. I think about Italy, for example. Some run surpluses over and above what EU rules require, but are unwilling to make use of their fiscal room, and they are called for that by their partners. I mean, Germany. And some may be both able and willing, but constrained under the rules of the pact. That's for France. So we'd have to find the right combination and also to reduce macroeconomic imbalances better than we do today. Designing an overall positive fiscal stance for the euro area will therefore require some dexterity. Countries with low growth, high unemployment, and high legacy debt could contribute to the stance to close the output gap and reduce unemployment. But this will come with heightened risks for their financial stability. Countries with relatively higher growth, low employment, and fiscal room for maneuver could contribute to help these risks in check, but it is unclear how this will benefit to other euro area member states in the short run. In other words, we may very well engineer overheating in Germany while failing to support growth in other countries, and that's not what we want. Success, so, is possible, but it is not unconditional. Ensuring effective impact will require that utmost considerations is paid not just to the level of public finances, but to their quality and to their structure. We always talk about public expenditures as a block. No, the quality of public expenditure is certainly decisive. Spending for the sake of spending is not going to do Europe much good. What we need is spending that is targeted and that is efficient. And that's what, for example, the Juncker plan of 315 billion euros is about, because it's targeted on the economy of the future, on digital economy, and we are developing a digital single market, on mobilities, and we are also working on that, on energy, and we are also trying to create a single market there, on human capital, on research, and on innovation. This will be within reach when governments will be serious about systematically evaluating the quality of each euro they spend. And I'm in favor of developing the evaluation culture in our national governments. So, ladies and gentlemen and dear guests, balancing growth and fiscal responsibility in the euro area today is a challenge, but not one we are shying from. There may be more discussions at G7, G20 or IMF level on these subjects in the years to come. And this Commission, and I am personally, determined not just to shape the debate, but to make a decisive contribution. That's what I tried to do in this brief intervention, and thank you for listening to me.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I'm Andrea Montanino, the director of the Global Business and Economics Program. Let me start from the short term, what will happen in the coming days. As you know, member states has to deliver their draft budgetary plans by October 15 as part of the EU semester. Figures that the IMF just presented for the deficit of the overall euro area are not so bad. I would say the 2% for 2016 and 1.7% of GDP for 2017 are better than the aggregate of G7 or the aggregate of G20 advanced economies. So overall, the situation is good. But my first question is whether you expect some surprise or an easy client coming to your table by October 15. May I mention, suggest some names? Greece, Italy, maybe France, I don't know.
First, we don't have our own forecast yet. We will deliver it in the few weeks to come, probably beginning of November. But we share the view of the IMF that the pact has created a strong impact, and that the deficit in the euro area are now under 2%. I must recall that they were at 6% in 2010. And for those who believe that we are too lenient with the pact, I think this is a clear proof that the pact works. We can at the same time be intelligent and efficient. Second, one word on process. As was said, the euro area countries, except Greece, which is under program, have to deliver their draft budgetary plans before the 15th of October. Then there will be a discussion, first with the Commission, then inside the Council, because finally the Council takes the decision in order to say whether these draft budgetary plans are or are not compliant with the rules. I will just give you something which is not a secret. I will have bilateral meetings here in Washington, let's say with the Italian minister, with the Greek minister, with the Spanish minister, and maybe with the Portuguese minister.
Okay.
But, as I said, this commission is not about sanctioning. Our idea is that sanction is always a failure. It is a failure for the rules because it demonstrates that the rules, or it would demonstrate that the rules are not working. It would be, of course, a failure for the country. And when we talked about Spain and Portugal this summer, it is obvious that the signal of sanction or fines against Spain and Portugal would have been a disaster politically and economically. It would have shown that we are not building confidence. This Commission does not believe that sanctions should be avoided if they are inevitable, but they should be avoided if we can do better. And what is better is to discuss with the governments in order to find the right incentives for them to lead structural reforms and to reduce effectively the deficits. And when I come to those discussions with those ministers or others, this will be my attitude. I will try to find a good deal through dialogue so that we can say that their plans are compliant with the rules, with the flexibilities inside the pact.
And on this specific point, because I think it's important for an American audience to be a little bit more clear on this, there is always a lot of confusion on what flexibility can mean in the current juncture. So, for instance, you would accept a delay on reaching the objective of the medium-term objective in the medium term. Would you allow for some flexibility for additional investment? The refugee crisis. So where do you see the margin for a discussion with all the countries? I mean, not only those that you mentioned. Because growth is still weak.
We have said very precisely what are the flexibilities inside the pact. It was a communication of the Commission early January 2015. We should encourage a country which creates a lot of investments. We did with Italy. We should also help a country which leads structural reforms to gain some time. We also did that for Italy. We have to watch the situation in the economic cycle. We don't have to do that anymore because all countries now are in positive growth with inequalities, but a positive growth. We said we would be really ready to consider some expenses or expenditures for the refugee crisis, or for an earthquake, for example, or for a country which suffers from a terrorist attack. That was the case with Belgium, for example. So these flexibilities are precise, they are limited, and they are clearly explained. But all in all, the countries have to respect the criteria and to reduce their debt. That's the main problem, for example, with Italy or Belgium. They have to be under 3%. That's the problem with France. Some other countries have more complex issues. That's the case of Spain or Portugal. We also need to watch the structural effort. That is why I was talking about a kind of complexity. But again, globally, I consider this works, and we will end those discussions by mid-November, I hope positively, with all countries. There is, of course, a specific case, which is Greece. Greece is a country under program, and we will try in the weeks to come to create a global deal with Greece. And that global deal, to sum up, is first reforms. We need to implement reforms that are already in the memorandum of understanding between Greece and the EU. Then those reforms can lead to the coming back of confidence in Greece and also coming back of investors. And we see positive trends because Greece is now recovering growth. And after that, if there is an agreement on measures plus a good political and economic mood, we can consider a deal on debt measures. And I hope that this will be done before the end of the year. And of course, being here in Washington and nearby the IMF, I must say very clearly that we need to have the IMF on board. That is an element of security and reassurance for many partners inside the EU, and that the Commission would welcome that.
Yeah, this is, going to Greece, that's a clear path for the next month, but you said I think early this week, that you expect something by this Monday, this coming Monday. So what is the deadline you envisage, or say the positive outcome you envisage for the coming days in order to prepare the ground for the following weeks?
I don't want to be too technical, but we signed an MOU with Greece in July 2015. What is specified inside this MOU has to be implemented. We made an agreement, it was in May 2016, that opens the way for the disbursement of more than 10 billion euros. We have disbursed already more than 7. There are 2.8 billion that can be disbursed now in the weeks to come. For that, first, Greece needs to implement some strong reforms and to decide that in the days to come. We have a meeting of the Eurogroup in Luxembourg Monday. Fly back from here directly with other European financial affairs ministers, and then I hope that we can decide on Monday, on the basis of the commitments by the Greek government, that we will disperse another tranche of 1.7 billion, 1.1 plus 1.7 for debt arrears. Then we will open a second review, and this second review, which is more technical, it's about implementation, will have to be decided also before the end of the year. And if this is done, hopefully we can have a good climate to discuss on debt measures. That's what we decided in the Eurogroup in May, and I really want this roadmap to be filled.
Okay. Let me move a little bit on the medium term now, which is also part of what you said. You mentioned the simplification, the flexibility, and the positive fiscal stance as a way to implement the Stability and Growth Pact. I don't want to use the word reform the Stability and Growth Pact because it has been reformed too many times. So do you see this approach something that might be deliver in the next, say, 12 months as a task for your?
For the next 12 months, you must be conscious that there are elections in November here in the US, but that there are elections, I think, in March in the Netherlands, in May in France, in September in Germany, and somewhere in 2017 or early 2018 in Italy, not to mention Czech Republic. So the political timetable is not so simple for the next 12 months in order to take very important or structural decisions. But having said that, we need to prepare those decisions. As you said, I think there is no political room to change the treaties or to modify substantially the Stability and Growth Pact. There is no political willingness for that, and the Commission is not pushing for that. But there is, I think, some attention inside the Eurogroup, and Jeroen Dijsselbloem, the president of the Eurogroup, showed that during the Dutch presidency in order to make changes, in order to have a pact which is more efficient and which is more growth-friendly. And the three avenues I mentioned, I think, can be shared by the finance ministers in the framework of the Eurogroup. Can they be endorsed by the leaders in the 12 months to come? I'm not absolutely sure. But the pact must be respected. We are a rules-based system. We cannot become a fully institution-based system, but we can also reflect on simplifications that are necessary and on the rest of the reforms I mentioned.
May I insist on
economic coherence?
Yeah. May I insist on the deliverables for the next 12 months? Because, I mean, we believe that this is a critical juncture for Europe. So going a little bit beyond your specific portfolio, among the projects that the European Commission is putting forward for enhancing growth and jobs, which are those that you see as possible outcome in the next, say, 12 to 24 months? So the capital market union, the digital single market, the energy union, the banking union, the completion of the banking union.
I would say that all those files relate to a single issue, which is deepening and completing the single market. And this is clearly something on which we are making progress. And you mentioned them. Capital Market Union is still an objective. Digital single market, energy. And on this, I'm quite hopeful that we can find good results. For completing the banking union, there we have a quite tough decision, and I'm afraid that it's difficult to conclude it before the German election, because there is some reluctance in the debate, we know that, about deposit insurance scheme. Although the Commission proposed its own project, which is EDIS. A second avenue is investment. And on that, there were positive positions taken in the Bratislava summit. It was decided to double the so-called Juncker plan of 315 billion euros up to 2022, and first to have 500 million euros delivered by 2020. It is already a success because more than 120 billion euros have been decided in that framework. And so this is a second point on which we can make progress. The third point is about tax issues. It's the other part of my portfolio. I imagine that we can make tremendous progress in fighting tax evasion and tax fraud. And I will deliver a new project, which will be a new project on common consolidated tax base in Europe, which will be as good to fight tax evasion and also to reduce administrative burden for business. I'm not so sure that it can be concluded in 12 months because it's a very complex issue. And the fourth is maybe more for the medium to long term, is about deepening EMU. And there, I want to say a political world. We are 28 inside the EU today, but we are going to lead a negotiation with one member state which once decided to leave the Union. The 27 other member states decided that they would go forward. That was Bratislava's purpose. It was to show that there is no pause in the European project, and the accent was made on day-to-day Europe, on defense and on security. But we're not only 28 or 27, we are 19 in the framework of the Eurozone. And it would be a huge mistake, it would be a political fault to neglect the building of a stronger Eurozone. And this is why I'm in favor of a fiscal capacity for the Eurozone and also of a stronger governance of the Eurozone. I'm Commissioner for Economic, Financial, Taxation and Customs Affairs today. I would like my successor to be the Minister of Finance of the Eurozone, being as well a member of the Commission and a Vice President of the Commission, and chairing the Council there, and being also responsible in the face of the European Parliament, because we need to have democratic accountability. When we discuss about Greece, we discuss that between us in a closed room, and ordinary people wonder what's happening there. They have the right to know what's happening there.
I fully agree. I will send you an op-ed I wrote for La Stampa in Italian about the Euro finance minister.
I'm very much online with my Italian colleague Piercarlo Padoan on that, and I myself delivered some proposals when I was finance minister in France in 2013. So
I have a lot of questions, but maybe there are some questions from the audience. Yes, here.
Thanks, Andrea. Alex Breeze here with Commerzbank. Just to follow up on the latest point that you made, and the importance of deepening the monetary union. Building up fiscal capacity, of course, has been difficult so far because of strong resistance in some quarters, and the impression is that there has been no way to couple fiscal capacity or build up of a fiscal capacity at the center in Brussels with discipline on the fiscal front in member states. Basically, Germany seems to think that if there's a buildup of fiscal capacity in the center, that is, as you say, a free lunch for everybody else to tap into. How would you counter that argument and would try actually to make the case, if it's possible, that building up fiscal capacity could, in fact, lead to stronger national responsibility for the rest of the fiscal capacity that sovereigns, the member states, have? Thank you.
First, by recalling the facts, and you did that in your first intervention, it's wrong to consider that the pact is implemented in a lenient way. It works effectively. The level of deficits inside the Eurozone was 6% in 2010. It will be under 2% in 2017. There were at one moment 11 countries in excessive deficit procedure. Maybe next year, if France respects its commitments, which I think is doable, but I will be very attentive to that. There could be only one, Spain, in particular circumstances that we know, except Greece. There were 4 or 5 countries in assistance program. There is only one today. So it works, and it will continue working. And when we take decisions which are favorable to Spain and Portugal, I think they are politically and economically wise. So I really want to counter this opinion that the pact is not implemented in a strong way. But what we need is not only to have a strong monetary policy and also a sound fiscal policy. We need to have structural reforms and investment. What should be our goal in Europe? Our goal must be more growth and more jobs. And if it's not the case, all of Europe and in the euro area, then the populists will win in the end. And we must have that political debate, including with our German friends. I can understand that in the framework of the refugee crisis and in the approach of a tough elections are always tough. It's probably too early to make the progress. But I know that in Berlin and in the ruling parties, several of them, there is still the idea that we could move on afterwards. So we need to prepare the ground. The Commission is asked to prepare a white paper for the 60th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome in March in Rome, and we will do our job. It's a difficult year because of all these elections, but it must not be a blank year for the debate and for the conception of the solutions for the future.
We have so many questions, but I have to look at the watch, unfortunately, and the Commissioner has to leave, and we have the other part of the panel. So we will deliver a task force report before March 2017, and we will send you to have some ideas on what we see on this side of the Atlantic that Euro can do. I want really to thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And invite Marie on the stage and the panelists for commenting your your remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you, Commissioner. And I really very much look forward to the next 30 minutes. Do you want to stay with us? I look forward to talk prosperity and growth in the next 30 minutes with this esteemed panel, with Bart Oosterveld, Governor Costa, and Dr. Paul Sheard. Just very briefly, I will introduce the panelists, but you also all received the bios yesterday, and there are still some extensive bios outside. Governor Costa has been the governor of the Bank of Portugal since June 2010. He's also a member of the Governing Council and of the General Council of the European Central Bank, of the General Board of the European Systemic Risk Board, and the Financial Stability Board Regional Consultative Group for Europe. Bart Oosterveld is the Managing Director and the head of Moody's Sovereign Risk Group. In this capacity, Bart supervises Moody's global team of sovereign risk analysts, helps maintain the quality of ratings, and assures analytical leadership. And Dr. Paul Sheard is Executive Vice President and Chief Economist of S&P Global. In this capacity, he spearheads the company's economic and market thought leadership and engages with a broad range of market participants and external stakeholders. I very much look forward to our conversation. And to directly kick off the conversation, I would ask each one of you to react to what we just heard, both in the commissioner's speech and also during the very interesting Q&A. In a few sentences, what would each of you say are the elements and points that you could fully agree on? And what are the elements where you see points for disagreement? Why don't you start?
Yeah, thank you. First, let me set the record straight. You hold a very old bio of mine. I haven't had that job in 2 years. I'm a Chief Credit Officer at Moody's, and it's my pleasure to be here. And I want to thank the Slovak Council Presidency and the Atlantic Council for their interest in our views. I think the Commissioner's comments highlighted the dexterity needed to navigate this particular part of European economic integration. He cited the electoral calendar, so I don't need to repeat that, but I'm from a small European country myself. I'm from the Netherlands, which has its own elections. During the debt crisis, European policymakers were always fond of saying, well, look, we know there's a lot of noise, but the three large political blocs in Europe, so the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, and the Liberals, they always hold the median voter, and they always hold 60% of any voting distribution, and are all supportive of the European project. So one of the things we've commented on, and it's not just about Brexit, but in all these elections, is that we are much more focused than we were on political risks now even than we were a few years ago during the debt crisis. What you see it doing is eating up a certain amount of capacity, and we're market observers. I'm not in the rooms in Brussels, but for the next 2 years, instead of progress on the banking union or instead of progress on other important economic files, a lot of time will go to dealing with the Brexit negotiations. That's inevitable, as well as to handling this influx of refugees, which I'm always a bit surprised when people talk about the refugee problem, because for a continent with the demographics that Europe has, this is the economic equivalent of a birthday gift. This is a massive opportunity, relatively young, relatively well-educated, relatively entrepreneurial inflow of people. It's in everybody's economic benefit. That's one comment I would make, so that's broadly political, geopolitical risks. The second I would make is to echo his comments on the European Central Bank. We anticipate, and I think the Commissioner's comments corroborate that, some fiscal loosening and some kicking of fiscal policy, because the European Central Bank does seem to do a lot of it by itself, always has an extra tool in its arsenal. Even when we think it's using its last tools, there's always new tools to be found. But the bottom line is that they haven't lifted growth, inflation expectations, or the tools are getting less and less effective, I guess would be a friendly assessment. So I'll leave it at that, but look forward to discussing more.
Perfect, thank you. Governor Costa?
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure. First of all, we need to avoid one idea. Europe is growing. It's growing 1.6 this year, 1.7 this year. It will be growing 1.6 next year and the year after. This means that the question that we have is not the growth, but the growth that we need to absorb unemployment, and also to give room of maneuver to deal with other problems like refugees problem. And this means what we need to see is what can be done in order to increase growth. Because growth is there, first point. Second, we need to understand that till now we have economic and monetary union, with a monetary union arm that is efficient, that is showing that is efficient, and is the only game in town. And we need now to ensure that the economic arm is playing its role. And the economic arm is very dependent on a coordination and a cooperative game. And there is no cooperative game if there is no broker that will assure this cooperative game.
And this means that we need to ensure that someone at the center stays, I will say, the responsibility to ensure that the group's interests are prevailing on part interests. And this means that it needs to be independent, to be empowered, and to have the legitimacy to do it. It's why it's very important for me to have an independent Eurogroup president that will be empowered to do the cooperative game that we are looking for. Second, that will be in answering to the special format of the European Parliament with members states that are part of the Eurozone, and at the same time to get from this side a legitimacy to speak with the partners, because otherwise it's impossible to ensure that this cooperative game, that is the coordination of economic policies within the Eurogroup, will be optimized, because everyone is looking from a standpoint of view that is not the whole standpoint of view. And in that point, it's necessary to have someone that looks to the fiscal space of each partner and asks for the right answer in terms of fiscal policy, but also in terms of structural policy, asks for the structural policy answer. It's impossible to look to it in with the idea that one size fits all, because there is a diversity, and Commissioner Moscovici underlined this point. But it's also impossible to have a cooperative game that will be optimal if someone stays beyond what is necessary to do. Second point, in what concerns the fiscal space, we need to distinguish between fiscal space and fiscal stance. There are countries that have no fiscal space but need to review their fiscal stance, looking to their expenditure and looking to their tax system in order to have a fiscal stance that is growth-friendly. This means to review what are the expenditures, those that are needed for social cohesion, those that are needed for growth, and those that are a waste of money. And it's necessary to do that. And same in the tax system, in order to ensure that we have the right answer on the fiscal side. But at the same time, we need to understand one thing, that the key point on that area is to grow, to increase the potential growth. Without increasing potential growth, there will be two side effects that are very difficult to manage. We don't create jobs, and we don't create an increase in the natural rate of interest. And if we don't increase the natural rate of interest, we have a problem in what concerns I will say, the financial stability. And this is the point that we need to care about. When we speak about potential growth, we are speaking about natural rate of interest, and we are speaking about a long-term financial stability stance. Without that, it's impossible to speak about financial stability stance, because you care of one side and you are uncovering the other side. You need to care about the two sides, and this means that the problem with the monetary policy is not the low interest rate environment. The problem is that we are not, on the side of potential growth, we are not an answer in increasing potential growth, increasing natural rate of interest. If natural rate of interest was high, the present situation in what concerns monetary policy will be very favorable to increase the growth of the euro. It's why, for me, it's clear that we need to have the two arms articulated, the two arms optimized, and for that there is a missing actor, that is the Eurogroup president, that needs to be a full-time president, independent, and accountable to someone, that is European Parliament, national parliaments, in order to give him the legitimacy that is needed. Otherwise, it's impossible to have an optimal answer from the economic side.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting. What do you think, Paul?
Well, thanks very much, Maria. It's a pleasure to be back here again. Another full room. You
Yes.
really know how to pack the house here at the Atlantic Council. So, you ask agree, disagree. Maybe if I just kind of give some sort of things that strike me. As a
Absolutely.
chief economist sitting in New York, looking at Europe from afar across the Atlantic. And maybe relate that to some of the comments of the Commissioner. I mean, the first thing is, I see a large economic area where there is still a very serious deficiency of aggregate demand. You can see that in the unemployment rate, for example, the unemployment rate, which are around these numbers, but pre-crisis was about 7%, it went up to 12%, it's only down to 10%. You can see that in levels of GDP. Size of the Eurozone economy now, let me focus on that because I think it's the most problematic part, has only barely recovered the pre-crisis 2008 level. It's about 1% above. That number for the US is about 11%. So in this very muted recovery from... Oh, sorry, I lost it, did I? Okay. Well, it was all bad news, so you didn't need to do it. But in this very muted recovery, in the developed world that we've seen, a 10 percentage point gap, if you like, has opened up between the Eurozone and the US in terms of GDP. So clearly there are problems with the macroeconomic situation in Europe. And I guess when I hear European policymakers speak, I'm looking for sort of signals and signs that they're kind of on the case. And I think I don't sense enough urgency, I guess. Now, the governor made a very important point about potential growth, but one of the points which is at the end of the day what really drives living standards. But one thing, let's not forget that you also need to have aggregate demand in line with the potential of the economy. And if you have a big output gap, you don't have that. And there's a negative feedback loop, because if you allow unemployment to stay too high for too long in Europe, that what started out as cyclical unemployment will turn into structural unemployment. That means not just tragedy for the people concerned, but a permanent impairment of the long-term potential growth. So I guess my first point is the urgency issue. Now, if you read President Juncker's State of the Union that was mentioned, I think the first page of that is a very sobering document to read, where he talks about Europe in an existential crisis. And I don't think he's just talking about Brexit. The second, I guess, impression that I had is heard a lot about rules today. And I was very interested to hear the Commissioner say 2 or 3 times that it was unrealistic to expect Europe to go to an institution-based framework. I don't exactly know what that means. But when I look at the Eurozone, when I look at the European Union as well, what I see is still major problems in call it the economic, the monetary, the political architecture of the European Union, and within that, importantly, the Euro area. So I would go back to the 4 Presidents report of 2012. I would go to the 2015 5 Presidents report, which was all about completing the economic and monetary union, or building a genuine economic and monetary union. Now, the Commissioner did mention the white paper in March, which I understand will be a follow-up to that 5 Presidents report from last year, which basically said Europe, the European Union, needs to complete the banking union, needs to build a capital markets union, but there's also important references in there to going towards fiscal union. And I would really sort of urge more of a front-loading there, because, again, we heard a lot today about there's been this wonderful improvement in budget deficits from 6% to 2%, but the budget deficit should not be an end in itself. It should be a means to an end, and the end should be growth and prosperity. And one of the problems, as I see, and I think many economists who look at the Eurozone in particular see this, is an architecture where you have a monetary union without a fiscal union, which severely constrains the ability of member states to engage in countercyclical fiscal and monetary policy. They don't have their own monetary policy, obviously, by definition. But those policy tools are severely hampered. So again, we heard about flexibility. The more flexibility that policymakers in Europe can muster to deliver better economic outcomes sooner, I think that's very much called for. My last point just is more on the politics, which, for an economist takes you into uncomfortable territory. But another very common thing that we hear all the time is sort of elections coming up. And we have, Dutch, German, French, heard about Czech, Italy at some time. And implicitly, when I hear reference made to elections, and sometimes I ask the explicit question. It sort of feels like we sort of, they're a bit of a hurdle. We need to somehow navigate them, and then once the elections are over, we can move forward with some of these structural issues. I think at the end of the day, unless Europe derives, and the European leaders derive political legitimacy for what they need to do to really put the European Union and the Eurozone back on a sound footing, that has to be driven by politics. Politics can't be something that sort of, puts the game on hold for a while we get around it. Elections out of the way, now we can do something. I think the people of Europe need to be very much engaged in defining their future.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would now like to just move to, Andrea already touched upon this with the Commissioner, the IMF budgetary projections that have been released recently. Andrea mentioned this before, but for all of you who weren't in the room, overall, the euro area budget balance is projected at 2% of GDP in 2016 and 1.7% of GDP in 2017. And in the coming days, the deadline is October 15th. All member states will submit their budgetary plans if they haven't done so already. Bart, I think I want to start with you, if that's okay. Which countries do you expect to maybe pose some kind of a problem? Or let me pose it differently. Where do you see the biggest differences or deviations between the proposals that the member states put forward and that the IMF put forward? And as a direct follow-up question, how do you think, how do you balance the member states' need to respect the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact on the one hand, while also on the other hand aiming for higher growth rates on the other?
I very much agree with something Paul said earlier, is that these 3% numbers and the 60% numbers aren't goals in and of themselves. They're means to an end. I think listening to the Commissioner, they view the process as being quite smooth this year. They all flew to Washington and nobody's talking about the euro area. They're talking about other things like emerging markets or China. And so I think it'll be a relatively smooth process from their perspective. How long this breather lasts, global conditions are still relatively benign, but the UK was a bright spot a year ago. Clearly, it's now more of a source of concern. The US had solid growth, has solid growth. What next year will bring with the rise in corporate leverage and the uncertainty around the election outcome is a question. China is growing more slowly, and Brazil, Russia aren't helping out. So the global growth conditions are feeble, so I don't know how long this cheerful period of relatively easy budgetary process in the euro area can or will last. And as the Commissioner said, and I mentioned earlier, there will have to be some fiscal loosening here and there. Where exactly and how to do that between the countries that have the space but maybe not the willingness, and countries that have the willingness but not the space will be difficult. I think the next few days, Greece, I think I would echo the Commissioner. It's a case in part. It's in a program. I think Spain, hasn't had a government in a year. Is politically in what is probably best described as a stalemate situation. And I expect we'll hear about Italy, Portugal, and France as well. So,
Paul, do you maybe want to comment on that too? Do you agree, disagree? Where do you see growth going in 2017?
Well, I think what we're seeing at the moment is, relative, as the Governor mentioned, relatively positive situation where European Union or the Eurozone can grow, 1.5%. But that's a base case scenario, obviously. And there's lots of things to worry about. And how Brexit plays out is clearly near the top of the list. What happens in China with their debt overhang is also something that is potentially hanging over the global economy. But without getting into the weeds of the budget discussions there, again, I was struck 2.5 weeks ago in New York. A lot of the leaders were in town for the General Assembly. Italian Prime Minister Renzi spoke at the Council on Foreign Relations. I don't know if anybody tuned into that, and it was on the public record, so I can say what he said. But he said two lines which really hit me right in the middle of the forehead. He said, "Austerity is not the way for Europe. It is the way to destroy Europe." So I find a little bit of a disconnect when we have this discussion about the decimal points on budgets, etc. And it feels very much like, you know, the tail wagging the dog a little bit here. But when I hear the leader of the third largest economy in the Eurozone make a statement in public, which is really, you know, quite a shocking statement, I think that's a wake-up call. So I think, you know, again, my perspective would be step back a little bit here.
Okay.
It's not just about rules. Rules, we shouldn't be worshipping at the feet of rules just because we have those rules. We should be, we politicians, policymakers, economists, whoever, society, you know, should be looking at the welfare of people. And, you know, where is Mr. Renzi coming from? I'm not here to defend Italy, but as an economist, I look at the data, and I mentioned that the Eurozone GDP is only barely 1% above the 2008 peak. That number for Germany is more than 6% above, but for Italy, it's 8% below. So there's a 14% gap opened up between the levels of GDP. So, you know, there is something really serious and compelling that I think we need to look at in the Eurozone. And I do think at the end of the day, it's all about the architecture. So it's not about the rules, it's about what is the right institutional framework, economically, monetarily, politically, for Europe. And I don't think we should lose sight of that debate. And it worries me a little bit that that debate has actually receded. If you look at Bratislava, for example, of course, terrorism, security, common defense, these issues are important. But it was supposed to be, we're not going to talk about Brexit, we're going to talk about the way forward for the European Union. I hardly saw any reference in that declaration to what to do about the economic and monetary union, which I think has many of these economies in a kind of macroeconomic vice.
Thank you. Governor Costa, I would actually like to take advantage of the fact that we have the governor of the Bank of Portugal here. And I read a lot about the Portuguese banking sector lately. And, you know, the IMF also wrote in a June 30 report, the Portuguese banking sector or the Portuguese banking system continues to operate in a challenging environment. What exactly does that mean, and how would you assess the state of the Portuguese banking sector today?
With pleasure. After I will
Oh,
go back
absolutely.
to the rules in Fisher's question, because it's very important. In what concerns the Portuguese banking sector is with the right level of capital. It's why it's complying with the rules of European Banking Union. Is doing the adjustment is needed. It was done a big deleveraging. This means that they came from a size of 170 to the size of 105, 106. This means a big adjustment in their business model. They are doing the reduction of costs, but they are suffering with the impact of the crisis on the SME side. And this means, like other countries, and I will not name any other, they need to absorb the NPLs that are on their balance sheet. These NPLs are well evaluated. It's why they were able to pass the QR and other exercise and stress tests. But it stays like a burden because it's not productive, it's not generating income, and it's consuming capital. And the problem that we have for the banking sector is that they need to raise capital in order to get rid of these assets that are not generating income, and in order to increase their profitability and in order to increase the capacity to support recovery. But as they have a lower profitability, they are in a vicious circle. They have a low profitability. This means that they are not attracting enough capital, and as they are not attracting enough capital, they have no possibility to get rid of these non-performing loans, and it's a vicious circle. They need to cut this vicious circle. They need to go to the market and to show to the investors that they have a business plan that will be very attractive when they get rid of these non-performing loans. And it's what they are doing now. And if you look to our financial system, you see that the four main banks will be at the end, I think at the 9 months period, on his own way, able to solve the problem. It's not it will be a problem that will be solved by each one in a different way. But the question is to raise capital, to get rid of these non-performing loans, to raise profitability and to increase the capacity to attract investors and to lend to the economy. And this is the point. But it's not peculiar to the Portuguese case. It's a common problem of every country that was going through a crisis and where namely the SMEs were suffering with this crisis. There is nothing new if you compare with the economic handbook. It's something that was clear. It was impossible to see what will be the extension of the crisis in 2011 when we began our adjustment program. We were with projections that were better than the final result. It was impossible to see at that time what will be the number for NPLs. But what we see is that banks were able to cope with this problem as it was, I will say, emerging. And now they need to have a final solution. That means to get rid of assets that are well priced, but if they want to get rid in one shot, they need to accept a different price, and different price means need of capital. Let me go only one minute on question of rules and institutions. We need to understand that the European Union is a very peculiar exercise in sharing sovereignty. It's an experience that was not done anywhere. And there is a balance always between rules and institutions. At the beginning, the institutions were there, the rules were there, namely in the competition side. And we were in a situation where the institutions were, I will say, able to cope with the new problems till the creation of single market. When we had the single market creation, it was necessary to go ahead with the monetary union in order to ensure stability. And when we decided to go for monetary union, it was necessary to ensure trust among the partners in order to be able to cope with different preference at the national level in terms of inflation, in terms of monetary policy, and to ensure that all will be together. And for that, it was necessary to establish rules to ensure trust among the partners. The debt rule are part of this, I will say, this agreement. It's a marriage contract. Like in a marriage, you need to have a contract, we have some rules, and we need to ensure that all are behaving within these rules. When the rules became normal in the behavior of people, like in a marriage when you are sure that you don't need to look if everything is going in the right, you can give more leeway to go ahead, and it's where comes institutions. And we need to make a good dialogue between rules and institutions. Rules are needed for institutional step forward, and the institutional step forward means that there will be more flexibility interpreting the rules.
I could not agree more.
Point.
Unfortunately, time flies when you're having fun. So I heard that I got a 3-minute warning a few seconds ago that it's about 3 minutes between us and the coffee break. So we don't want to stand in the way too long for that. However, as a closing question, to tie this back into the overall topic of our panel and the conference, if you had 1 minute, and you basically really just have 1 minute, to explain to someone where do you see the economic future after Brexit, and what are the 2 main deliverables for Europe in the next 2 months, what would you say?
Okay, well, in 1 minute. Brexit is at the European level, mostly just a very complex file. We're starting to publish research about details of Brexit, such as passporting, and you see the complexity of each sub-item, and you see the capacity that it's going to take up, so that's one comment. We downgraded our growth forecasts for the UK mostly, and a little bit for Europe in response to the vote. It's very questionable whether this has positive ramifications for the UK, and especially within the UK for the people who voted for Brexit, ironically. Deliverables for Europe, we're market observers. I don't think we can give recommendations like that. What struck me from the Commissioner's comments was the dexterity required to manage the next 2 or 3 years and make progress on key files. And I think there's a lot of complexity in each of these files.
Perfect, thank you.
Should I jump?
Yes.
Well, again, I mean, just in terms of Brexit in Europe, I mean, I've sort of used the term that Brexit is is a wake-up call for the European Union. In other words, it's as much about what Britain and how it forges its future. It's as much about Europe and what happens to the European Union 27. So I think there the issues really are. To me, the whole debate, the flavor of it at the moment is a little bit too sort of 0-1. You're in or you're out. The UK has been part of the European Union in this project for 60 years or so. There's an enormous amount of glue in the system. The United Kingdom is not going to Brexit and then just float off into the mid-Atlantic. It's still going to be sitting there on the edge of Europe. So I think on both sides, just sort of perhaps some cooler heads prevailing and a little bit more sort of creative and sort of friendly thinking about how do we sort of recontract. This is not about saying goodbye and never seeing each other again. It is a recontracting kind of issue. And I think the point the governor made, we haven't heard this word a lot today about sovereignty, that there is this kind of selective pooling of sovereignty in the European Union, both in the economic sphere, the political sphere, in terms of freedom of movement, etc. as well. And I think that's what a lot of the issues that have come to the fore in Europe over the last few years, Brexit just being the latest example, sort of all about is the way that Europe has decided to share the various elements of sovereignty really the optimal way to do it. And that's why I come back to the political point. You can't leave the politics out of this. So it's not a 2-month solution, but I think front-loading and having that in your field of vision, I think is very important. What is the Europe that the Europeans want to build for the future? And how do you make it work? Because I don't think it has been working very well in the last few years.
Thank you. Governor Costa, what do you think are the 2 main deliverables?
First of all, what concerns Brexit's impact, it was, for the moment, smaller than we were expecting. Second, as you said, it's clear that we are in a need of a new contract between UK and the European Union. And it's important for everyone to know what will be the contract in order to bring down the uncertainty. And the contract will be for the European Union one that will be compatible with the preservation of single market, the preservation of 4 freedoms, and the preservation of the evolution of the European Union. It's clear that at the end of the day, it will be understood by UK that there were a lot of beneficial effects of being part of the European Union. And it's also important for the European partners to understand that to stay in the European Union is more beneficial than to go other way. And I think that Brexit will be, at the end of the day, I will say, a fact that will increase the cohesiveness of the European Union, not the contrary. You will see. For that, it is necessary to increase growth, because the growth is the cement that we need for the project to go ahead. If there is no growth, there will be some doubts, and it's why I'm in agreement with your idea about the aggregate demand increase and the need of autonomous increase in aggregate demand through the use of fiscal space that is available and through optimal coordination of policy. What is important is to ensure that the process is a well-designed process, that there is no increased uncertainty, and every side knows very well what will be set state at the end, because it means that for everyone it's clear where it will be possible to invest or not to invest, what will be the relationship. In what concerns the next year or deliverables, what I will wish is more, I will say, more close coordination among economic policy ministers, and it goes beyond finance ministers. Second, more clear vision about structural measures. Third, a clear utilization of aggregate demand increase on the case of states that have poor infrastructure, have fiscal space, and are with a surplus. And finally, and it is very important, to ensure that there is an institutional framework that will be that will encompass all that. And as we know very well that it's not possible to do it within the European Union framework, we need to do it in the Eurozone framework, and it will go by two steps. First step is more intergovernmental through the finance ministers, and the second step, I hope, that it will be enlarged to the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I could not agree more. We need more cooperation. We're always stronger with allies, as the conference teaches us today. I hope you will be able to join us for the session after the coffee break. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much to the panel for this enlightening conversation. Thank you all.